Well, here's a fun fact about the galaxy. When you put humans, aliens, and apex predators in the same room, things tend to go sideways faster than a drunk pilot in an asteroid field. And on the remote research station orbiting Kethmora, things were about to go so sideways they'd practically be upside down. The Kethmora research facility wasn't much to look at, just another prefabricated cluster of domes and connecting tubes that the Galactic Federation liked to plop down on scientifically interesting worlds. What made this particular rock interesting were its natives, the shadow maws. Think of the biggest, most terrifying panther you can imagine. Then give it crystalline claws that could slice through starship hull plating, telepathic abilities that would make a mind reader jealous, and the general attitude of something that knew it was at the top of the food chain and didn't particularly care what anyone else thought about it. Naturally, humans wanted to study them, because that's what humans do. See something that could effortlessly turn them into bite-sized snacks and think, "Oh, we should definitely get closer to that." Commander Garrett stood in the facility's main observation deck, watching the morning shift change through the reinforced windows. He was one of those military types who'd somehow managed to keep most of his hair and none of his illusions about the galaxy being a reasonable place. Co-commanding this tin can with Sub-Admiral Vextai, a Zelonian who had all the warmth of liquid nitrogen and twice the charm, had taught him that diplomacy was just warfare with better manners. "Sir?" The voice belonged to Ember, the 19-year-old intern who had somehow become the facility's unofficial Shadowmaw whisperer. She stood in the doorway, her standard-issue jumpsuit somehow looking less like a uniform and more like something she'd thrown on after crawling out of an alien cave system, which, knowing Ember, was probably exactly what had happened. "Let me guess," Garrett said without turning around. "You want to spend more time with the Cubs? Benjamin said no, and now you're here to ask me to overrule the head of xenobiology." "Actually, I was going to ask if you'd seen the approaching Zelonian diplomatic vessel that's been broadcasting encrypted military codes for the past 20 minutes. That got his attention. Garrett spun around so fast he nearly gave himself whiplash. "What diplomatic vessel?" "The big, scary-looking one that's currently parking itself in our orbital space without so much as a, 'Hello, nice day for a completely unscheduled visit, isn't it?'" Ember's tone carried that particular blend of sarcasm and genuine concern that made her either the best intern he'd ever worked with or the one most likely to get them all killed. Possibly both. The communication system chose that moment to crackle to life. "Kethmora Research Facility. This is Ambassador Theknor of the Zelonian Diplomatic Corps. Prepare for immediate boarding and inspection. This facility is now under Zelonian jurisdiction, pending investigation of Federation violations of the Kethmora Accords." Garrett felt that familiar sinking sensation that usually preceded what military strategists like to call a very bad day. The Kethmora Accords were the treaty that had established the research station in the first place, a delicate balance between Federation scientific interests and Zelonian territorial claims. If someone was claiming violations, "Well," he muttered, "that's just fantastic." Within the hour, the facility's docking bay was crowded with enough Zelonian soldiers to invade a small moon. Zelonians were basically what you'd get if you crossed a crocodile with a chess grandmaster and gave the result a really bad attitude about everything. Ambassador Theknor was a particularly fine specimen, 8 feet of scaled muscle and political ambition, wearing the kind of diplomatic robes that somehow managed to look both elegant and threatening at the same time. "Commander Garrett," Theknor's voice had the subtle warmth of grinding metal, "I trust you understand the gravity of this situation. I understand that you've just declared a Federation research facility under your jurisdiction without so much as a formal complaint filed through proper channels, Garrett replied, doing his best to sound diplomatic rather than like someone whose day had just been completely ruined by reptilian politics. Perhaps you could enlighten me as to exactly what violations we're supposed to have committed. Theknor's smile revealed teeth that could double as industrial cutting tools. Your facility has been conducting unauthorized research on indigenous Kethmaran wildlife, specifically the cultivation and potential weaponization of shadow maw specimens. And there it was. The real reason for this unscheduled visit had nothing to do with treaty violations and everything to do with the 3 adolescent shadow maw cubs currently residing in Habitat Module C. Cubs that had been rescued as orphans and were being raised for eventual release back into the wild. Cubs that, in the wrong hands, could be turned into living weapons of war. Dr. Benjamin chose that moment to arrive, looking like someone who'd just been dragged away from very important scientific work to deal with very unimportant political nonsense. He was the kind of researcher who could probably recite the complete genetic structure of a shadow maw from memory, but would forget to eat lunch if someone didn't remind him. "Ambassador," Benjamin's voice carried the particular strain that came from 3 years of trying to study highly intelligent predators while being constantly interrupted by bureaucrats. "I assure you that our research has been entirely within Federation guidelines. The cubs are being prepared for reintegration into their natural habitat, nothing more." "Ah, yes, the cubs." Theknor's eyes, which were the cold yellow of a predator sizing up its prey, fixed on Benjamin with uncomfortable intensity. 3 juvenile shadow maws, raised in captivity, completely dependent on human caretakers. How convenient that such scientific subjects would be perfectly suited for military training. That's when Ember decided to join the conversation, because apparently a room full of armed aliens making barely veiled threats wasn't tense enough without adding a teenage intern with a talent for saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time. "With all due respect, Ambassador," she said, stepping forward with the kind of confidence that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, "you clearly don't know the first thing about shadow maw behavior if you think they can be weaponized." The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Sub-Admiral Vextai, who had been standing silently beside Theknor like a scaled statue of disapproval, actually hissed. Garrett felt his career flash before his eyes. "Perhaps," Theknor said with the kind of smile that made smart people start looking for exits, "we should examine these cubs for ourselves." "Captain Mordak?" Captain Mordak stepped forward, 7 feet of military precision, wrapped in enough combat armor to stop a small artillery shell. He was the kind of soldier who looked like he could stare down a supernova and ask it to try harder. "Sir, my teams are prepared to secure all biological assets for transport." "Excellent. Commander Garrett, you and your staff will evacuate the habitat areas immediately. Any interference with this operation will be considered an act of aggression against the Zelonian Empire." And just like that, 3 months of careful diplomatic balance went straight down the waste recycler. Garrett found himself caught between Federation regulations that required him to protect the research facility and Zelonian guns that suggested cooperation might be a better career choice. "Ambassador, surely we can discuss this." "The discussion is over, Commander." "Captain, proceed." As Mordak and his soldiers headed toward the habitat modules, Garrett caught sight of Ember's face. She looked like someone who'd just watched a favorite pet get sentenced to execution. The girl had spent 6 months working with those cubs, longer hours than most of the senior staff. She'd been the first human to successfully establish communication protocols with juvenile shadow moths, the first to document their complex social behaviors, the first to prove they could form emotional bonds with other species. And now, a bunch of soldiers were going to stuff them into transport cages like common animals. "This is going to end badly," Garrett muttered to Benjamin. "Define badly," Benjamin replied, watching the soldiers disappear down the corridor. "Well, let's see. We've got 3 highly intelligent predators who've never seen weapons before, a bunch of trigger-happy soldiers who think everything with claws is a potential enemy, and 1 very stubborn intern who's probably not going to just stand by and watch this happen." "Ah." Benjamin adjusted his glasses with the air of a man contemplating a particularly complex mathematical equation. "That kind of badly." From somewhere deeper in the facility came the sound of heavy boots marching in formation, followed by the distinctive whine of energy weapons powering up. The Zelonians weren't taking any chances. Garrett activated his comm unit. "Security, this is the commander. I want all non-essential personnel evacuated from the habitat modules immediately. And someone find Ember before she does something heroic and stupid." The response crackled back. "Sir, Ember's already in Habitat Module C. She says she's not leaving the Cubs." Of course she wasn't. Because in a galaxy full of reasonable, sensible people who understood that discretion was the better part of not getting shot by alien soldiers, Ember had to be the one person who thought sitting between 3 predatory animals and a squad of armed Zelonians was a good idea. "Commander." Thexnor's voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose plans were proceeding exactly as expected. "I suggest you convince your intern to cooperate. My soldiers have orders to secure those specimens by any means necessary." Garrett looked at the ambassador's cold yellow eyes, then at Benjamin's worried expression, then at the corridor leading to what was probably about to become ground zero of the galaxy's most awkward interspecies incident. "You know what?" he said, surprising himself with how calm he sounded. "I think I'll let you explain to a 19-year-old girl why she needs to abandon 3 animals she's spent half a year caring for. I'm sure that conversation will go exactly as smoothly as everything else today." And with that, Commander Garrett settled back to watch what promised to be either the most touching display of interspecies loyalty in galactic history or the shortest diplomatic career on record. Possibly both. If there was one thing Captain Mordak had learned in 15 years of military service, it was that simple operations had a tendency to become complicated very quickly. What should have been a straightforward secure the assets and load them onto the transport mission was rapidly turning into the kind of situation that ended up in training manuals under the heading "What Not to Do During Diplomatic Operations." The problem wasn't the Shadowmaw cubs themselves, although 3 juvenile apex predators, each weighing roughly 200 pounds and equipped with claws that could slice through battle armor, did present certain logistical challenges. The problem wasn't even the facility's automated defense systems, which his technical team had disabled within minutes of boarding. No, the problem was one stubborn human girl who apparently hadn't received the memo that when soldiers with energy weapons told you to evacuate, the appropriate response was not to sit down, cross-legged in the middle of the habitat, and start humming what sounded suspiciously like a lullaby. "Miss," Mordak said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that usually made junior officers stand straighter, and enemy combatants reconsider their life choices. "You need to leave this area immediately." Ember looked up at him with the sort of expression usually reserved for people who just suggested that gravity was optional. No. It was amazing how much defiance could be packed into such a small word. Mordak had faced down armed rebels, negotiated with pirate lords, and once talked a suicidal bomber out of taking half a space station with him. But somehow, one human teenager saying no while sitting next to 3 alien predators was proving to be his most challenging assignment yet. Behind her, the 3 Shadowmaw cubs were doing their best impression of oversized house cats. They'd retreated to the back of their habitat when the soldiers first appeared. A sensible response that had given Mordak hope this might actually go smoothly. But as soon as Ember had settled herself near the habitat's entrance, they'd begun creeping forward again, their crystalline claws clicking softly against the artificial stone floor. "Miss," Mordak tried again, "these creatures are dangerous. For your own safety." "Their names are Midnight, Storm, and Echo," Ember interrupted, not bothering to stand up. "And they're not dangerous to anyone who doesn't mean them harm." The largest cub, Midnight apparently, chose that moment to pad forward and settle down beside Ember with all the casual grace of a predator who knew exactly how intimidating he looked and didn't particularly care. His shoulder came up to Ember's chin even while he was lying down, and his eyes, a deep violet that seemed to hold far too much intelligence for comfort, fixed on Mordak with the kind of steady regard that made the captain's hand drift instinctively toward his sidearm. "Sergeant Colvin," Mordak activated his comm unit without taking his eyes off the cubs. "What's the status on the tranquilizer nets?" "Ready for deployment, sir. Neural disruptors are also online." "Good. Prepare to—" "You use those," Ember's voice cut through his orders with the sharp edge of genuine anger. "And you'll traumatize them permanently. Do you have any idea what 6 months of trust building looks like when it gets destroyed in 30 seconds? Actually, Mordak didn't. His experience with trust building mostly involved convincing enemy forces that surrender was preferable to being turned into component atoms. But he was beginning to suspect that whatever the human girl had accomplished with these creatures went considerably beyond standard animal training. The second cub, Storm, presumably, had joined Midnight at Ember's side. She was smaller than her brother, but somehow more alert, her head turning constantly to track the movements of Mordak's soldiers. The third cub, Echo, remained at the back of the habitat, but his eyes never left the group around Ember. "Dr. Benjamin," Mordak activated the facility's internal comm. "Please report to Habitat Module C immediately." When Benjamin arrived, he looked like a man who'd been hoping this whole situation would resolve itself while he wasn't paying attention. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, and his glasses sat slightly crooked on his nose, the universal signs of a researcher who'd been dragged away from something important to deal with something impossible. "Ember," he said, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion that came from 6 months of trying to manage a brilliant intern who had absolutely no sense of self-preservation. "You need to let them do their job." "Their job," Ember replied without moving, "involves putting my cubs in transport cages and shipping them off to become weapons of war. So, no, I don't think I do need to let them do that." "They're not your cubs," Benjamin said gently. "They're juvenile Shadowmaws who need to be returned to their natural habitat." Which is exactly what we were doing before Ambassador Scaly McPolitics showed up with his army of toy soldiers. Mordak felt his jaw tighten. He'd been called worse things than a toy soldier, but usually not by unarmed civilians who were currently sitting within easy striking distance of 3 apex predators. The fact that the cubs showed no signs of aggression was almost more unnerving than if they'd been snarling and pacing. "Miss Ember," he said, falling back on the diplomatic training that all Zelonian officers received and most of them ignored. "I understand your attachment to these creatures, but they represent a significant strategic asset. They represent 3 orphaned babies who lost their parents to a mining accident and needed someone to care for them," Ember shot back. Just because they could be weapons doesn't mean they should be. That was when Commander Garrett decided to join the party, probably because the day hadn't been quite complicated enough already. He took one look at the scene: armed soldiers surrounding a habitat containing 3 predators and 1 defiant human. And Mordak could practically see him adding up all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. "Captain!" Garrett's voice carried the weary authority of someone who'd been dealing with impossible situations for longer than he cared to remember. "Perhaps we could discuss alternative approaches to this situation." "The ambassador's orders were quite clear, Commander. The specimens are to be secured for transport." "The specimens," Ember said from her position on the floor, "can hear you talking about them like they're furniture, and they don't appreciate it." As if to emphasize her point, Midnight lifted his head and fixed Mordak with a stare that somehow managed to convey both intelligence and mild disapproval. It was the kind of look that made you wonder if the creature was actually understanding every word of the conversation and finding your contribution lacking. "Sir," Sergeant Colvin's voice crackled over the comm, "we have the tranquilizer nets in position. On your order." Mordak studied the scene before him. 3 cubs, 2 humans, and enough political complications to end careers. The smart move was to order the nets deployed, secure the targets, and let the diplomats sort out the aftermath. But something about the way the cubs had positioned themselves, not defensively, not aggressively, just protectively around the human girl, made him hesitate. "Ember," Benjamin tried one more time, "please. If you interfere with this operation, you could be charged with obstruction of a diplomatic mission." "If I don't interfere with this operation," she replied, still not moving from her spot between the cubs and the soldiers, "3 innocent animals are going to spend the rest of their lives in military training facilities learning how to kill on command." Storm, the smaller female, had moved even closer to Ember, her massive head now resting across the girl's lap like an oversized cat seeking comfort. The casual intimacy of the gesture was almost shocking. These weren't trained animals performing tricks. They were displaying the kind of emotional bond that usually took years to develop. "How long did you say she's been working with them?" Mordak asked Benjamin quietly. 6 months. Every day, sometimes 18 hours at a time. She's documented behaviors we never knew Shadowmaws were capable of." "Such as?" Benjamin adjusted his glasses, a gesture that usually preceded either very good news or very bad news. "Emotional recognition, complex problem-solving, cooperative communication with other species, and what appears to be empathic bonding." Empathic bonding. Mordak felt something cold settle in his stomach. If these creatures could form genuine emotional connections with their handlers. "Ambassador Theknor to Captain Mordak." The comm crackled with imperial authority. "Status report." Mordak looked at Ember, still sitting calmly between 3 predators who could tear apart his entire squad if they chose to. He looked at the cubs, who seemed more interested in staying close to their human companion than in the soldiers surrounding them with weapons. He looked at Benjamin and Commander Garrett, both clearly hoping this situation would somehow resolve itself without anyone getting hurt. "Sir," he replied, "we have encountered some complications." "Clarify." "How exactly did you explain to an ambassador that a simple retrieval mission had turned into a philosophical debate about animal rights, conducted in the presence of 3 telepathic predators who seemed to have opinions about the proceedings?" The specimens appear to have formed an attachment to one of the facility staff. Removing her from the area may cause them to become unpredictable. There was a long pause. Then, "Captain, are you telling me that A human child is preventing an entire squad of Zelonian soldiers from completing their mission. When you put it like that, it sounded even worse. Sir, the situation is complex. Another pause. Then the sound that every soldier in the galaxy learned to recognize and dread. An angry superior officer activating transport systems. I'm coming down there personally. Do not take any action until I arrive. The comm went silent. Mordak found himself looking at a habitat full of predators, a stubborn human girl, and what was shaping up to be the most awkward standoff in the history of interspecies relations. Well, Commander Garrett said with the kind of cheerful resignation that usually preceded spectacular disasters, this should be interesting. And in the back of the habitat, Echo, the smallest of the cubs, finally padded forward to join his siblings, completing what looked less like a threatening display of predatory power and more like a family gathering around their favorite human, which, Mordak was beginning to suspect, might actually be exactly what it was. Ambassador Theknor arrived in Habitat Module C like a diplomatic hurricane wrapped in ceremonial robes and bad intentions. He swept through the entrance with the kind of presence that made everyone in the room suddenly very aware of their place in the galactic food chain, which, in his case, was somewhere well below Zelonian ambassador having a very bad day. Captain Mordak, his voice could have frozen plasma. Explain to me how 6 soldiers armed with military-grade capture equipment are being stymied by one human child. Mordak straightened to attention, though part of him was wondering if his military training had covered situations quite this bizarre. Sir, the specimens have demonstrated unexpected behavioral patterns. Any attempt to separate them from the human may result in— I don't care if it results in a galactic peace treaty, Theknor snapped. Those creatures represent the future of Zelonian military dominance. We are not leaving this facility without them. From her position on the habitat floor, Ember looked up at the ambassador with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who'd just kicked a puppy in front of a kindergarten class. You know, for a species that prides itself on tactical intelligence, you're being remarkably stupid about this. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Sub-Admiral Vextai, who had followed Theknor into the habitat, actually took a step forward with her hand moving toward her sidearm. I beg your pardon? Theknor's voice carried the deadly quiet that preceded either apologies or executions. You want to turn them into weapons, Ember continued, apparently unaware that she was talking to someone who could have her arrested for diplomatic insubordination. But you haven't bothered to understand what they actually are. Behind her, all 3 cubs had risen to their feet. Not aggressively. There was no snarling, no baring of those crystalline claws that could shred battleship hull plating. They simply stood, forming a loose semicircle around Ember with the casual confidence of creatures who knew exactly how dangerous they were and felt no need to prove it. What they are, Theknor said, his yellow eyes fixed on Midnight's impressive bulk, is the most efficient killing machines this galaxy has produced in 10,000 years. What they will become is the edge that wins wars. What they are, Ember shot back, is a family. And that's when it happened. Mordak had been watching the cubs carefully, ready to order his troops to deploy capture nets at the first sign of aggressive behavior. He'd been expecting snarls, territorial displays, maybe even an attack if the creatures felt sufficiently threatened. What he hadn't been expecting was for all 3 Shadowmaws to completely ignore him and his soldiers. Instead, as Theknor moved closer to the habitat entrance, the cubs did something that made every tactical manual in the galaxy suddenly irrelevant. They walked past 6 armed soldiers without so much as acknowledging their existence and settled down at Ember's feet like oversized house cats, claiming their favorite sunny spot. Midnight, all 400 pounds of crystalline claws and telepathic intelligence, lay down with his massive head across Ember's lap. Storm curled up against her right side, purring with a sound like distant thunder. Echo, the smallest but somehow most alert of the three, positioned himself at her back, facing the room with calm violet eyes that seemed to take in everything and judge it all mildly interesting, but ultimately harmless. "What?" Thecnor said, after a long moment. "Are they doing?" "Being cubs," Ember replied, scratching behind Midnight's ears in a way that made the enormous predator's purring intensify. "This is what they do when they're happy and feel safe." Dr. Benjamin, who had been watching the scene with the fascination of a researcher witnessing something unprecedented, stepped forward carefully. "Ambassador, what you're seeing is unprecedented interspecies bonding. In 3 years of studying adult shadow maws, we've never observed behavior like this." "I don't want bonding," Thecnor snapped. "I want weapons." "Well, that's your problem right there," Commander Garrett said, moving to stand beside Benjamin. "Because what you're looking at isn't weapon material. It's something much more interesting." Sergeant Colvin, who had been maintaining position with his capture net for the past 20 minutes, finally lowered his equipment. "Sir, I can't get a clear shot without risking the human." "Then move the human." "Sir, with respect, we've been trying to move the human for the past hour." Thecanor's gaze shifted back to Ember, who was now somehow managing to pet all 3 cubs simultaneously while maintaining eye contact with him. "Miss, you will move away from those creatures immediately, or I will have you forcibly removed." "No, you won't," Ember said with the calm certainty of someone who had just figured out something important. "I beg your pardon?" "You won't have me removed, because the moment you do, they'll get upset. And when they get upset," she gestured vaguely at the 3 predators currently using her as furniture. "Well, let's just say that your tactical advantage disappears pretty quickly." To emphasize her point, Storm lifted her head and fixed Thecnor with a stare that somehow managed to be both completely calm and utterly terrifying. It was the look of a predator that had sized up potential prey and found it adequate. "They're not aggressive," Benjamin said quickly, apparently recognizing the expression on Thecnor's face. "But they are protective, and they can sense emotional intent." "Explain." Benjamin adjusted his glasses, falling into the familiar rhythm of academic explanation. "Shadow maws are empathic telepaths. They don't just read thoughts, they read emotions, intentions, the underlying psychological state of other species. They can tell the difference between someone who means them harm and someone who genuinely cares for them. And they trust Ember completely. She spent 6 months proving to them that humans can be safe, nurturing, protective. To them, she's family." Thecnor studied the scene before him. 3 apex predators arranged around one human girl like a living fortress of claws and crystalline death, all of them completely relaxed despite being surrounded by armed soldiers. "Captain Mordak, deploy the neural disruptors." "Sir, that could—" "Deploy them." Mordak hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then military training overrode personal judgment, and he nodded to his troops. The neural disruptors powered up with a high-pitched whine that made everyone in the habitat wince. The devices were designed to temporarily scramble the nervous systems of large predators, rendering them unconscious without permanent damage. Against creatures with standard neural structures, they were remarkably effective. Against creatures with telepathic abilities and empathic bonding, they had a somewhat different effect. All three cubs raised their heads simultaneously, their violet eyes suddenly blazing with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected illumination. The air in the habitat seemed to thicken, and every human in the room felt a sudden pressure behind their eyes. Not painful, but definitely present. "Turn them off," Ember said quietly. "I don't take orders from—" "Turn them off," she repeated, and this time her voice carried something that made Thecnor actually take a step backward. "You're hurting them." The cubs weren't snarling or showing any signs of aggression. Instead, they were doing something far more unnerving. They were staring at the soldiers with expressions of profound disappointment, like children who had just discovered that the adults they'd trusted were planning to do something terrible. "The disruptors aren't working," Sergeant Colvin reported, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "They're not being affected." "Because they're not just animals," Ember explained, her hand moving soothingly along Midnight's neck. "They're people. Different people, but people nonetheless. And people don't respond well to being attacked by strangers." "Impossible," Thecnor said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Is it?" Benjamin stepped forward, his scientific excitement overriding his diplomatic caution. "Ambassador, we've documented complex problem-solving, emotional recognition, cooperative communication, and now empathic resistance to neural interference. These aren't just intelligent predators, they're a sentient species." The implications of that statement hit the room like a collapsing star. Sentient species enjoyed certain protections under galactic law. They couldn't be enslaved, weaponized, or treated as military assets without their explicit consent. "Even if that were true," Thecnor said slowly, "they're still cubs. They can't give legal consent." "No," Ember agreed, "but their guardian can." "What guardian?" Ember smiled for the first time since the Zelonians had arrived, and it was the kind of smile that suggested someone had just realized they held all the winning cards in a very high-stakes game. "Me. I've been their primary caretaker for 6 months. Under Federation law governing orphaned sentient species, that makes me their legal guardian until they reach maturity." The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for moments when the universe suddenly reveals that it has an even more twisted sense of humor than anyone had previously suspected. "A 19-year-old intern," Thecnor said slowly, "is claiming legal guardianship of 3 potentially weaponizable apex predators." "A 19-year-old intern," Commander Garrett corrected, with the satisfied tone of someone who had just watched a brilliant legal maneuver unfold, "is claiming legal guardianship of 3 sentient beings who have the right to choose their own destiny." And as if to emphasize the point, all 3 cubs turned to look at their various observers with expressions that somehow managed to convey both intelligence and a mild amusement at the sudden change in everyone's attitude toward them. "Well," Midnight seemed to say without making a sound, "this is interesting." The next few minutes would later be described in diplomatic reports as a period of tense negotiation, which was roughly equivalent to calling a supernova a minor stellar event. In reality, what happened was Ambassador Thecnor standing very still while his entire worldview rearranged itself around the inconvenient fact that his perfectly planned military operation had just been derailed by interspecies adoption laws. "This is absurd," he finally managed, though his voice lacked the imperial authority it had carried earlier. "You cannot simply declare yourself the guardian of—" "Actually," Commander Garrett interrupted, pulling up a holographic display from his wrist unit, "Federation law is quite clear on this point. Section 12 of the Sentient Species Protection Act states that any being who has provided primary care to orphaned sentients for a period exceeding 4 months automatically assumes guardian status, unless formally contested through proper legal channels. Which, Benjamin added with the satisfied air of someone who had spent 3 years documenting every interaction with the cubs, would require a formal hearing where you'd have to prove that removing them from their current environment would be in their best interests. Thecnor looked like someone who had just realized that his perfectly crafted political maneuver had somehow transformed into a custody battle. This is unprecedented. Yes, Ember said, still calmly petting Midnight's massive head. It really is. Turns out when you spend months learning to communicate with someone, you occasionally discover they have opinions about their own lives. That's when Echo decided to contribute to the conversation. The smallest of the 3 cubs rose smoothly to his feet and padded directly toward Ambassador Thecnor with the kind of purposeful movement that made every soldier in the room tense up. Energy weapons swiveled to track his approach, safeties clicked off, and Mordak's hand moved to his sidearm. "Nobody move," Ember said sharply. "Let him do what he's going to do." Echo stopped directly in front of the ambassador, close enough that Thecnor could see his own reflection in those unnervingly intelligent violet eyes, and did something that nobody in the room had expected. He sat down, not in a predatory crouch, not in an aggressive stance, but in the same relaxed position that house cats had been using to indicate, "I am not currently planning to eat you," for roughly 10,000 years. Then he tilted his head slightly and waited. "What?" Thecnor said very carefully. "Is it doing?" "He," Ember corrected, "is trying to show you something. Put your hand out." "Absolutely not." "Ambassador," Benjamin said quietly, "this may be the most significant moment in interspecies communication history. Echo is attempting to initiate direct empathic contact." "With all due respect to history," Thecnor replied, "I am not placing my hand within range of those claws." Echo made a soft sound, not quite a purr, not quite a sigh, but somehow conveying a sense of patient disappointment. Then he did something even more unexpected. He lay down completely, rolling slightly onto his side to expose his stomach and throat in the universal gesture of submission and trust. "Oh," Vextai breathed, speaking for the first time since entering the habitat. "Oh, that's what trust looks like," Ember finished. "He's showing you that he doesn't see you as a threat, even though you've been pointing weapons at him for the past hour." Thecnor stared down at the young Shadowmaw, who continued to lie vulnerably at his feet, violet eyes fixed on the ambassador's face with an expression of calm expectation. "This is a trick," he said, but without much conviction. "Ambassador," Mordak said quietly, "if it were a trick, wouldn't he be in a better position to attack?" There was a long moment where the only sounds in the habitat were the soft purring of the other 2 cubs and the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Then, very slowly, Thecnor extended his hand toward Echo's upturned head. The moment his scaled fingers made contact with the cub's crystalline crest, everything changed. Later, Thecnor would struggle to describe the experience to the Zelonian High Command. It wasn't telepathy in the traditional sense. No words or images were exchanged. Instead, it was something far more fundamental, a direct emotional connection that bypassed language entirely and went straight to the core of understanding. In that instant, he felt what Echo felt, the deep contentment of being among family, the absolute trust in the beings who had cared for him since his parents' death, the genuine affection for the strange bipedal creatures who had proven themselves worthy of pack bond status, and underneath it all, a profound sadness for the frightened, angry beings who surrounded him with weapons because they couldn't understand that love was stronger than force. But more than that, he felt Echo's nature, not the killer that military planners imagined, but something far more complex and infinitely more valuable. The cubs weren't just empathic, they were natural peacekeepers, evolved to sense and soothe aggressive emotions in other species. Their presence on Kethmora hadn't just maintained ecological balance, it had prevented countless conflicts between the planet's various intelligent species. "By the depths," Thecnor whispered, his hand still resting on Echo's head. "You're not weapons at all." "No," Ember said gently. "They're healers." The ambassador straightened slowly, his expression transformed from predatory calculation to something approaching wonder. "The rebellion in the outer systems, if we brought them there." "They'd stop the fighting," Benjamin confirmed, "not through violence, but by helping both sides remember what they were really fighting for underneath all the anger and fear." "And they'd do this willingly?" All three cubs turned to look at him, and somehow their combined gaze conveyed a simple message. "We do what needs to be done, when those we trust ask us to do it." "The choice would be theirs," Ember said, "as it should be." Thecnor was quiet for a long time, his tactical mind working through implications that stretched far beyond military strategy. Finally, he activated his comm unit. "This is Ambassador Thecnor to the diplomatic vessel. Cancel the asset retrieval operation. We'll be establishing a new protocol instead." "Sir?" Captain Mordek's voice carried polite confusion. "We're not taking weapons back to the Empire, Captain. We're taking something much more valuable. Hope." 6 months later, the first Shadowmaw Peace Corps was established on the contested world of Zerion Prime. The fighting that had raged for 3 years ended within a week of their arrival, not because anyone was defeated, but because it became very difficult to maintain murderous rage toward your enemies when a 400-pound telepathic cat was helping you work through your emotional issues. Ember, now officially the youngest diplomatic liaison in Federation history, spent her days traveling between worlds with Midnight, Storm, and Echo, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the galaxy was the ability to help people remember how to be kind to each other. And in the halls of the Zelonian High Command, Ambassador Thecnor kept a holographic image on his desk. 3 young Shadowmaws curled up around a human girl, all of them fast asleep in the afternoon sunlight of their habitat. It served as a daily reminder that the universe's greatest victories often came disguised as the simplest acts of love. The irony wasn't lost on him that the Zelonian Empire, built on the principle that strength came through conquest, had found its greatest diplomatic tool in 3 creatures who conquered through compassion instead. The Peace Corps program had become so successful that other species were beginning to request Shadowmaw mediators for their own conflicts. The Andromedans, who had been locked in a trade dispute with the Centauri for 8 years, resolved their differences in 12 hours once Storm arrived to help them sort through their mutual resentment. "Ambassador," his aide had asked just last week, "how do we explain to the military council that our most effective strategic asset is being nice to people?" Thecnor had considered that question carefully before responding. "We tell them that sometimes the strongest position is the one that doesn't require weapons to maintain." It was a lesson that a 19-year-old human girl had learned sitting on a habitat floor, surrounded by soldiers who had confused love with weakness. The galaxy, as it turned out, had been making that same mistake for millennia. But thanks to 3 cubs who had chosen trust over fear, that was finally beginning to change. After all, sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is choose to sit down peacefully instead of standing up to fight.